plundering these countries by establishing even more ferocious colonial oppression, as well as suppressing the growing anti-imperialist national liberation movement in the countries of Asia and Africa. In Iran, the American imperialists sought to destroy the Iranian economy and cause hunger and poverty in the country, weaken Iran economically and politically, put an end to its independence and sovereignty, and completely enslave this country, turning it into their colony and anti-Soviet foothold. In recent years, the US imperialists have been demagogically negotiating a $250 million loan to Iran through the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then through the US Export-Import Bank. During this time, representatives of the US ruling circles, including Truman and Aitchison, repeatedly made statements about American economic assistance to Iran, although Iran never received the loan. The US imperialists made extensive use of the 3-year loan negotiations to enslave Iran. Speculating on promises of a loan, the Americans forced Iran to enter into an agreement with the American company Morrison-Knudsen Company, as well as 2 agreements with the Overseas Consultants Incorporated, a consortium associated with the oil company Standard Oil, to invite American economic advisors in connection with the development of a 7-year plan. According to an agreement signed in the autumn of 1949 between the Iranian Planning Organization, created to direct the work on the preparation and implementation of the 7-year plan, and this consortium, American advisors established control over manufacturing, mines and mines, road construction, radio and communications, railroads, agriculture, electrification and irrigation, finance and monetary settlements, the purchase of equipment, and other important branches of the Iranian economy. In essence, the American imperialists were trying to restore the failed mission of Millspo in 1945, which, like these advisors, had done Iran enormous harm. In September 1950, Makki, a member of the Iranian Majlis, who asked the government about the activities of American advisors harmful to Iran's national interests, stated that these advisors had already cost Iran more than $1,100,000 and 20 million rials. U.S. trade with Iran also had a pronounced colonial character, destructive for the Iranian economy, and in particular, for the Iranian national industry. In 1948, the import from the USA to Iran amounted to 1,058 million rials, while the export from Iran to the USA was only 352 million. 122 million rials. Thus, during this time, American imports to Iran were almost 20 times higher than American exports from Iran. Subsequently, the situation did not change at all in favor of Iran. Under the demagogic talk of a loan to Iran, the American imperialists were actually pumping out the Iranian currency. It is very characteristic that the Americans filled Iran mainly with such goods as could be produced by Iranian industry and handicrafts. The Iranian market is littered with cotton fabrics, metalware, paper, glassware, and other American goods of very low quality, as well as old, second-hand clothes, low-grade haberdashery, chewing gum and the like, which are not sold in America and in the markets of other countries. The Iranian market is littered with these low-grade American goods, which are sold at dumping prices. The United States almost completely monopolized the import of cotton fabrics to Iran, which in 1949 tripled in comparison with previous years. If in 1947 Iran imported 4,900 tons of cotton fabrics worth about 400 million rials, US share, 23%, and in 1948, 4,600 tons worth about 480 million rials, US share, 27%. Then for the first 10 months of 1949, the import of fabrics amounted to 11,780 tons, in the amount of about 1,250 million rials. This amount of fabrics imported to Iran from January to October 1949, of which the United States accounted for 70%, was 3.5 times the country's annual need for imported fabrics. As a result, the Iranian economy was brought to full strength. Iranian factories and plants, as well as handicraft enterprises, were not able to withstand competition with American goods. Iran's industry, strangled by the American imperialists, was going through a severe crisis. The textile industry was in a particularly difficult position. Many large ones have already closed. Textile factories in Isfahan, Yezd-Bushi, Avaz, Shiraz, Tabriz, Qom, Mashhad. Many tanneries also closed, Cannery B, Bandar Abbas and other factories. Many industrial enterprises are on the eve of the termination of work. According to the Tehran newspaper Setar, on March 11, 1950, about 40 representatives of Iranian private enterprises told the Minister of National Economy Iran, an-Nosser, that if the government does not take restructuring measures to protect Iranian industry, then unfortunate factories in Iroda, they will close in the near future. Ruined Lee's also craft and handicraft industry. Many hundreds of handicraft enterprises and handicraft workshops have already been ruined, or are on the verge of ruin. In a circular of the Council of Ministers, Dubulsko-Vatsno in the newspaper, Eteldat, on February 8, 1950, it was said that in Yezd 30,000 weavers do not have work and live life in general. June 1949, that the continuation of the current situation will naturally entail the closure of all handicraft enterprises and factories. The catastrophic reduction in Iranian exports, KR, which was the result of the management of the American and British imperialists. The export of rice, for example, decreased from 58 dys T.V. 194 g, up to 3.2 thous. TDD 98, Echatayas Header Bida, PR Agriculture, Ironed. Kotor V connections, with, conservation, feudal regeneration and without. Then it was in a catastrophic state, the peasants threw their land, and the Dilma, in the city even. Amir Yichskstsr. Correspondents are forced to VT DRIZNDT, TDZAAD 1Y Kurdiz, re-register, DEM, owned by Iran's agriculture. So, the Tehran correspondent of the New York Times newspaper Ross reported in early 1950 that in the regions of Ardabil, Marat and Arazbaran, 50,000 peasants abandoned their land and went to the cities. In Iranian Azerbaijan, Khorasan and Sistan, which are known as the most fertile regions of Iran, hunger and poverty reigned. The commission of the Iranian government, headed by Minister without portfolio Ali Askar Hekmat, which left in early 1950, from Tehran to Iranian Azerbaijan to survey the situation on the ground, said in her report to the government that over the past 100 years, Iranian Azerbaijan has never been in such a dangerous and difficult situation, and that if they are not accepted immediate measures to improve the economic situation and reducing unemployment, then with Azerbaijan it will be the same as that. And with the depopulated areas of the coast of the Persian Gulf, which are in a hopeless situation. The newspaper, Bakhta, wrote on August 9, 1949, that famine reigns throughout Iranian Azerbaijan, and in the provinces of Sistan and Khorasan, which always had stocks of their own grain. The population, like cattle, roams the fields in search of edible herbs. The dominance of the American-British imperialists led to an undermining financial system of Iran. The Iranian rial is depreciating, according to the statement of the director of the Iranian National Bank, published in the newspaper, et-la.at. On November 11, 1947, the dollar rose from 36 to 76 rials in the last year and a half alone. The process of depreciation of the Iranian currency continued in the future. The deficit of the state budget grew catastrophically. If in 1947-48 the deficit was 1,678 million rials, with revenues in the amount of 6,084 million rials, then in 1949-50, it increased to 3 to 130 million rials with revenues of 7,705 million rials. The glut of the Iranian market with American goods, a sharp decline in the purchasing power of the population, and a reduction in exports caused massive bankruptcies. Within just 1 month, in the spring of 1950, more than 200 bankruptcies were registered, with capital ranging from 20 million to 200 million rials. The disorganization of the Iranian economy caused by the dominance of the American imperialists was accompanied by an unprecedented increase in poverty and widespread famine. As a result of the suffocation of the national Iranian industry and the closure of many factories, plants and handicraft enterprises, as well as the collapse of agriculture, unemployment has reached unprecedented proportions. In Tehran in the middle of 1950, there were over 100,000 unemployed. In Isfahan, several tens of thousands of workers and craftsmen also lost their jobs. The Tehran newspaper, Artesh, reported in April 1950 that in Iranian Azerbaijan the number of unemployed and impoverished peasants without shelter and food was in the hundreds of thousands. Iranian Prime Minister Razmara, in a statement to a United Press correspondent in September 1950, reported that the total number of unemployed in Iran was 500,000. In enterprises where workers had not yet been laid off, wages were cut sharply and were not paid for many months. Many tens of thousands of artisans are ruined, have lost their jobs and are doomed to starvation and poverty. Unemployed, impoverished, hungry and homeless people crowd Tehran and other cities. The Americans exacerbated the famine with their speculative machinations. In February 1949, the Sofia newspaper Novini reported that the Americans, using their privileged position in Iran, were buying up grain and transporting it on American trucks to Iraq, where they sold it at speculative prices. Were transferred to Iraq through Kasashirin, Mehran and the port of Abadan tons of wheat at the same time, as the Iranian press reported. Under the guise of help, the Americans and the British were selling their rotten grain products to Iran. The Najat magazine, for example, reported in January 1950 that in Khuzestan, 20,000 tons of rotten wheat purchased by Iran from the USA and England were thrown into the Karen River, so that the rotten smell would not disturb the hungry people living on the banks of the Karen. Driven to despair, hungry, impoverished people committed suicide. It was not uncommon for mothers to kill their children and then commit suicide. In 1949 alone, about 500 suicides were registered. Due to mass poverty, overcrowding of the overwhelming majority of the population, as well as due to the extremely unsanitary condition of cities and the lack of purified drinking water. Epidemics of typhus, smallpox, and other infectious diseases raged in the cities. In the winter of 1949-50, a severe typhoid epidemic raged in Tehran, from which, according to the Tehran newspapers, many people died. The newspaper Faryad Meliat wrote in June 1950 that in the last year, about 70,000 people had died from smallpox alone in Iran. The collapse of the Iranian economy and the catastrophic growth of unemployment and poverty were also recognized by the leaders of the Iranian government. At the end of June 1950, Iranian Prime Minister Razmara, in his speech on the radio, stated that the country's economic situation is deteriorating more and more every day, and poverty is increasing. And on July 26, 1950, speaking at a meeting with the participation of the Minister of Labor, educators, merchants and clerics, he admitted that the streets and squares of the cities of Iran are filled with beggars, vagabonds and the unemployed. These were the results of American economic aid to Iran. Simultaneously with the collapse of the Iranian economy and finances, the American imperialists, violating the sovereignty of Iran and trampling on its independence, took all possible measures to turn Iran into an anti-Soviet, anti-democratic springboard. American military advisors and experts have controlled the Iranian army, gendarmerie and police for a number of years. By May 1950, there were already about 80 American military advisors in the Iranian army, headed by General Evans. Every branch of the military, infantry, tank units, air units, communications, commissary service, every major military unit, as well as military schools, had American officers assigned to them to supervise and direct their activities, and to train the Iranians in handling American weapons. In Tehran and other garrisons, courses were set up to study the English language. In the officers' school, training was conducted according to American programs. Groups of Iranian officers were sent to study at American military schools in the US and Europe. In Turkey, Iran and Afghanistan, American advisors created unified armies with the same uniform, a single charter, and with the same type of weapon. The weapons and military equipment arriving from the United States to Iran were placed by the Americans at certain bases, and only a small amount was transferred to the Iranian army for development. Applications for the weapons of Iran drawn up by American military advisors many times exceeded Iran's needs, and were designed to increase the Iranian army by 4 times. Over 20 large airfields, naval bases in Sharpa, Bushehr and Bandar Abbas, and strategic roads were being built under American supervision in the country. Expenditures on this construction, carried out according to plans in the interests of the American imperialists, as well as expenditures on equipping the army, gendarmerie and police with American weapons, on the maintenance of American advisors, and on other military purposes, absorbed more than 3/4 of all budget expenditures. It is these expenditures were the main cause of the catastrophically increased budget deficit. American officers, military attachés, and other intelligence officers systematically traveled to the northern regions of the country to survey the Iranian-Soviet border. They made topographic surveys here, examined the condition of roads and bridges, inspected the ports and coastal islands of the Caspian Sea, inspected the units of the Iranian army located on the border. One carried out subversive work among the tribes, etc. in the spring of 1950. To inspect and verify the activities of American advisors in reorganizing and modernizing the Iranian army and turning Iran into a springboard for an aggressive war against the USSR, General Collins, Chief of Staff of the American Army, came to Iran. In addition to the military treaties and agreements previously imposed on Iraq, on May 23, 1950, a new military treaty between the United States and the Iranian government, threatening dangerous consequences for the country, was signed in Washington. This agreement provided for doubling the American military mission in Tehran, which enjoyed the monopoly right to manage the Iranian army, to militarize the country, and also to use the resources of Iran for U.S. military purposes. The treaty also provided for new deliveries of American weapons and ammunition. The American military has taken the Iranian army to such an extent that it has, to a large extent, already lost its national character. This might not cause indignation in the Iranian army and especially among young officers. Boyards that young Iranian officers and soldiers will turn American weapons against the Americans themselves, military mission first to establish their own, even over control, lower positions in the military. Under the pretext of the unpreparedness of the Iranian officers in command of the Iranian military units were replaced by Americans. But in spite of all these measures, the U.S. military command is not convinced that it will be able to use the Iranian army as an effective force to carry out the aggressive plans of CIA. All the while, the American imperialists have hesitated to the armament plan. Iranian nomadic tribes and the use of gangs of armed nomads under the command of the reactionary Hanvi for military operations in the highlands and for the fight against democratic organizations. With these plans, the implementation of which would have meant the weakening of Iran and undermining the authority of the central government, was also connected with the bill introduced in July 1950 and the 1st Majlis, Bill B, some administrative decentralization in the administration of the provinces, the political circles of Tehran. This project was characterized as autonomous governments in it to carry out American goals. The American militarists, over the head of the government, hurriedly armed the southern and other Iranian tribes in secret order. Provocative activities were carried out among the tribes, aimed actually at weakening Iran and undermining its independence and sovereignty. Most notable in this respect was a trip to Iran in 1950 by U.S. Supreme Court Justice William Douglas under the guise of mountaineering. After a series of meetings in Tehran, Douglas made a trip to Iranian Azerbaijan, Kurdistan and Luristan at the end of August 1950, and then in early September he visited Isfahan, Shiraz and the areas inhabited by the Bakhshia and Kashkai tribes. During this climbing trip, Douglas led provocative activities among the tribes, calling on the tribes to resist and to guerrilla warfare. As the Tehran newspaper, Dad reported in September 1950, In the zone of the Berkshire tribes, Douglas met with the well-known reactionary Berkshire Khan Murtaza Quli Sam and suggested that he prepare 40 detachments of 150 people in order to train them in guerrilla warfare. Supply them American arms and money. According to another Tehran newspaper, Kesra, when Douglas was visiting the Kashkays, the leaders of the Berkshire tribes concluded an agreement in his presence, according to which they pledged to revolt against the government if it decides to disarm at least one of these tribes. The results of Douglas' provocative climbing trips were not long in coming. In the early days of September 1950, in Kurdistan, northwest of Kermanshah, the Javanrud Kurds, who turned out to have American weapons, opposed the government by refusing to obey the order of the authorities to disarm. Troops with airplanes were sent to the area of the uprising to suppress the Javanrud people. Fighting between the Kurds and government forces continued for more than a week. American provocations among the Kurds were not limited to this case. For a long time now, the Americans have carried out systematic provocative activities among the Kurds. They publish a regular newspaper in Kurdish in Baghdad. In order to seize the oil sources of the Middle East, they, through their agents, conduct provocative propaganda about the independence of Kurdistan, about the creation of a great Kurdistan, etc. In the south of Iran in Fars in early September 1950, when he stayed there among the Kashkai Khans Douglas, there was also an active activity of the Americans in arming the Kashkai tribes. As the Bakhter Emrouz newspaper reported, in the first days of September 1950, an American ship with a large cargo of ammunition stopped at sea near Bushehr. During the delivery of this cargo to the shore for shipment to the areas inhabited by the Kashkai, a clash occurred between those who were unloading the ship and the Iranian Coast Guard, in the result of which one disguised American soldier, who was on board the ship, was wounded. The newspaper wrote that the distribution of weapons and ammunition among the Kashkai tribes was entrusted to 2 American officers. According to the Artesh newspaper, in the secret report of the Governor-General of Fars Gulshan on the situation in Fars, sent on September 16 to Prime Minister Razmar, it was reported that only in recent days, 250 jeeps, 2,000 rifles of the latest system and a number of heavy machine guns. The newspaper added that 5,000 very well-armed fighters had already been mobilized among the tribes in Fars, who were provided with equipment delivered to the southern ports and placed at the disposal of the tribes. The American and British imperialists also continued their attempts to abolish Iran's foreign policy independence and turn Iran into their obedient instrument of an aggressive, anti-Soviet policy. It was for this purpose that they sought to draw Iran into the aggressive bloc of the countries of the Near and Middle East, which is being forged under the flag of the unification of Muslim countries. Related to this were attempts to revive the Sadabad Pact, as well as negotiations, agreements and treaties concluded in 1949 and 1950 between Iran and Transjordan, Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan and India. In order to carry out their plans of conquest, the US imperialists in every possible way fomented the chauvinist pan-Iranist propaganda of the reactionary Iranian circles. A handful of pan-Iranists from among the golden youth of the university, headed by well-known fascists in the past, including the former fascist Berlin radio announcer Shahkrokh, put forward extravagant provocative demands for the annexation of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Afghanistan to Iran. The democratic forces of Iran, led by the People's Party, waged a selfless struggle against the enslavement of Iran by US-British imperialism and its transformation into a tool and springboard for the implementation of aggressive, anti-Soviet plans. They tirelessly exposed the provocations and intrigues of the American and British imperialists. In 1948, the People's Party and other democratic organizations launched a campaign against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was predatorily plundering the national wealth of Iran, as well as against the 7-year plan and the further transformation of the country into a military raw material appendage of American and British monopolies. In the cities of Qom, Arak, Sultanabad, Ma'at and others, despite the brutal repression of the authorities, mass popular demonstrations took place against the policy of hunger, devastation, and poverty. The American British imperialists, an internal Iranian reaction, regarded the People's Party and other democratic organizations as a very serious obstacle to the implementation of their reactionary, adventurous, aggressive plans. With the help of all sorts of intrigues and provocations, they sought to completely stifle the democratic movement, which, despite severe persecution, continued to develop. On February 4, 1949, a provocative assassination attempt on the Shah was organized in order to create a pretext for the destruction of democratic organizations. Although the attacker was a correspondent for the reactionary newspaper Parcham Islam, which was close to pro-British circles, the authorities concocted a fake about his connections with the People's Party of Iran. Following that, the government introduced martial law in Tehran and other cities and provinces of Iran and ordered the dissolution of the People's Party throughout Iran, outlawing it. At the same time, dozens of democratic and progressive newspapers were closed. The premises of the Central Committee of the People's Party and other democratic organizations were smashed and confiscated. More than 1,000 activists of the democratic movement were arrested in Tehran and throughout Iran. For months, an Iranian military tribunal has been handing down massive sentences. 13 leaders of the People's Party and democratic trade unions were sentenced to death in absentia. Many were sentenced to long prison terms. The People's Party of Iran, the Central United Council of Trade Unions affiliated to the World Federation of Trade Unions, the Peasants' Democratic Organization, the Iranian Democratic Youth Organization affiliated to the World Democratic Youth Federation, the Iranian Women's Democratic Organization affiliated to the Women's International Democratic Federation, were forced to stop their legal activities and leave underground. The regime of police and military dictatorship was established in the country. But even by applying such draconian measures, the American British imperialists and Iranian reactionaries could not suppress the democratic movement in the country. The movement of protest and indignation embraced such wide sections of the population that the Iranian Majlis did not dare to discuss the bill against freedom of the press, urgently introduced by the Syed government immediately after the assassination of the Shah, and referred it to the Commission of the Majlis. The American imperialists have led the country into such a dead end that the ruling circles of Iran could no longer govern in the old way, on the basis of the old constitutional forms and methods. In 1949, for the first time in the history of Iran, a second, upper house, the Senate, was established, which the Anglo-American imperialists and Iranian reactionaries intended to use as a weapon in the struggle against democratic forces. According to the provision approved by the Majlis of the 15th Convocation, of the 60 members of the Senate, 30 should be appointed by the Shah, and the remaining 30 should be elected from a very limited circle of people. For elections to the Senate, a very high electoral qualification was established. The overwhelming majority of the population was deprived of the right to participate in elections to the Senate. In order to curtail the constitutional rights of the population, a Constituent Assembly was also convened in 1949, which revised some articles of the Constitution. The constitutional rights of the people were even more limited, and the Shah was granted broader rights in the affairs of government, in particular with regard to the dissolution of the Majlis and the Senate. In the autumn of 1949, elections were held for the 16th Majlis and the Senate. The People's Party boycotted these elections. Meetings of the Majlis of the new convocation, as well as the Senate, opened on February 9, 1950. The Majlis opened without 12 deputies from Tehran, whose elections were cancelled in December 1949 as a result of the protest of the leaders of the so-called National Front against falsification and abuse of power during the elections in Tehran. The National Front, headed by Dr. Mossadegh, was created during the elections to the 16th Majlis in October 1949 from among the opposition bourgeois nationalist politicians, who opposed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company against the dictatorship and put forward other opposition demands. Repeated elections to the Majlis held in February 1950 from Tehran gave the majority of votes to representatives of the National Front, headed by Mossadegh. In the context of rampant military police terror, the election of opposition deputies to the Majlis from Tehran testified to the growth of indignation against Anglo-American imperialism and its policy of plundering and enslaving Iran. The British colonialists were in complete agreement with the American imperialists in suppressing the democratic National Liberation Movement in Iran. They also actively cooperated with them in unleashing a new imperialist war and in turning Iran into an anti-Soviet, anti-democratic military strategic base. But at the same time, a fierce struggle was going on between the American and British imperialist predators in Iran for the monopoly robbery and exploitation of its people and national wealth. The intensification of the US expansionist policy in Iran led to a sharp aggravation of the contradictions between Britain and the United States. The British imperialists waged a desperate struggle to restore the monopoly dominance of British capital in Iran and organized the assassinations of the conductors of American policy in Iran. As mentioned above, the Anglo-American struggle led to frequent changes in Iranian cabinets. There was also a struggle between the British and American imperialists for financing the 7-year plan. In opposition to American promises of a loan, the British put forward deductions to the treasury of the Iranian government from the income of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company as a source of financing for the 7-year plan. The British imperialists also competed with the Americans in the foreign trade of Iran. British exports to Iran increased from 1,081 million rials in 1948 to 1,561 million rials in 1949. At the same time, the export of England from Iran amounted to only 329 million rials in 1948 and 411 million rials in 1949. These data showed that Britain's trade with Iran, like US trade with Iran, had a colonial character only for 1948 and 1949. Anglo-Iranian trade brought Iran a deficit, and the British gold currency in the amount of 1,902 million rials. But the main Anglo-American contradictions were concentrated mainly around South Iranian oil. We have already spoken of the attempts of the American oil monopolies to seize Iranian oil, or at least to get the British to allow them to participate as widely as possible in the exploitation of Iranian oil by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In 1948, the American monopolies sought to double the share of oil produced at the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and intended for American oil companies under the Anglo-American Agreement of 1946, fulfillment of their demands for the transfer of 45 to 5.0% of the total to American companies. Crude oil production, produced by the British in Iran, would mean the establishment of actual American control over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In an attempt to keep intact the positions seized in Iran in the field of oil exploitation, and pay off from these American demands, the British government put forward a proposal to renounce in favor of the United States its claims regarding the Bahrain Islands, and to transfer part of its rights to the extraction of Bahraini oil to American monopolies. In an effort to retain and consolidate the exploitation of South Iranian oil in the context of the aggravation of Anglo-American contradictions and the growing indignation of the Iranian people over the predatory activities of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British prepared the so-called Additional Agreement between the Iranian government and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This additional agreement provided for, in exchange, some change in the order of financial settlements between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the Iranian government in favor of the latter. To keep in force the articles of the Main Concession Agreement of 1933, thus all exclusive IRAVA and privileges the Anglo-Iranian oil companies, which infringe on the sovereignty of Iran and allow the British imperialists to plunder the national wealth of Iran and ruthlessly exploit its people, should have remained untouched. In July 1949, the Anglophile government of Syed submitted a draft, supplementary agreement, for approval to the 15th Majlis. But the 15th Iranian Majlis, at its last meeting, on the night of July 26 to 27, refused to approve this project. Many Tehran newspapers wrote at the time that the failure of the agreement which the British government had been trying to achieve for more than a year, was the result of American pressure and intrigues by American agents. However, despite this failure, the British did not abandon the idea of U-200B putting the additional agreement through the Majlis of the new 16th Convocation. In particular, they actively interfered in the elections of deputies to this Majlis in order to smuggle in as many of his protégés as possible and supporters in order to achieve the additional agreement in the future. The provocations and intrigues of the American-British imperialists are meeting with the growing resistance of the peoples of Iran, protesting against imperialist violence and oppression, against the policy of fomenting a new world war. Despite all sorts of obstacles put in place by the American and British imperialists and agents, the Iranian reaction, the peoples of Iran come out in defense of peace against the American-British warmongers. At the end of July 1950 in Tehran before formed by the advanced elements of the Iranian population, Iranian society supporter of the world under the chairmanship of the outstanding Iranian poet and public figure Malik Eshur Becker. This society brought together representatives of the general public, well-known Iranian figures of science, culture and art, as well as some deputies of the Majlis. The collection of signatures launched by the Society for the Stockholm Appeal of the Supporters of Peace was a great success. By December 1950, over 500,000 Iranian citizens had already signed the Stockholm Appeal. Just like all peace-loving peoples, the Iranian people spoke out against the US imperialist adventure in Korea. Under his pressure, the Iranian government, which supported the illegal decision of the Security Council on the Korean question, was forced to refuse to send its soldiers to Korea. The appeal for the conclusion of a peace pact also found the ardent support of the Iranian people. In March, April and May 1951 in Tehran and other cities of Iran, mass demonstrations and rallies of many thousands took place, the participants of which demanded the conclusion of a peace pact between the five great powers, the reduction of armaments, the expulsion of foreign military advisors from Iran, the recognition by Iran of the Chinese People's Republics. The demonstrators demanded an end to the war of conquest in Korea, curbing the American-British warmongers, providing support to the peace-loving peoples of the world, the peoples of the USSR, the countries of People's Democracy, the People's Republic of China, Korea, Vietnam, as well as an end to the persecution of peace supporters in Iran. The collection of signatures under the appeal for the conclusion of the peace pact was extremely successful. Over 150,000 signatures were collected in the first 9 days alone. In November 1951, 1,958,000 people signed the appeal of the World Peace Council in Iran. The mass movement for peace in Iran is combined with the growth of the anti-imperialist movement. In connection with the attempts of the British imperialists to impose on Iran a supplementary agreement on South Iranian oil in late 1950 and early 1951. A popular movement unfolded in the country not only against the approval of this agreement, but also for the annulment of the main unequal concession agreement signed in 1933. And for the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. In December 1950, as well as in January and February 1951, mass rallies and protest demonstrations took place in Tehran against the plunder of Iran's oil resources by the British imperialists. Progressive organizations were created, the Freedom Society of Iran and the National Society for the Struggle Against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. At the mass rallies in January-February 1951, held in Tehran, Qom, Resht, Hamadan, Abadan and other cities, demands were put forward. The transfer of all enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to the Iranian government free of charge, the rejection of all imperialist concessions, the granting of freedom press and freedom of activity to all democratic organizations, the abolition of martial law in the country, and respect for the rights of the individual in the political struggle. These demands showed that the Iranian people were not only against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, but also against imperialist policy in general, for democratic freedoms and for the national independence of the country. Under pressure from the widespread anti-imperialist movement, on January 11, 1951, the Iranian Majlis rejected the additional agreement with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. During the discussion on this issue and in the Majlis, the question was raised about the annulment of the concession agreement of 1933 and the nationalization of the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. American agents in Iran contributed to the failure of the additional agreement in the Majlis. The American imperialists tried demagogically to use the idea of nationalizing the oil industry and liquidating the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, popular among broad sections of the Iranian people, in their own interests. They sought in this way to undermine the positions of their British competitors, and also expected, under the guise of providing assistance to Iran in organizing the oil industry, to gain free access to Iran's oil resources. At the very least, they thought, the prospect of nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company would make the British more accommodating about allowing U.S. oil companies to exploit Iranian oil. In response to the popular movement against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, to the rejection of the supplementary agreement, and to the question of nationalizing the oil industry raised in the Majlis, the British imperialists mobilized every possible means to put pressure on Iran. They resorted to their usual methods of provocation and intrigue. At the end of 1950, rumors spread in the countries of the Middle East about the forthcoming creation of a new, independent Arab state in the Persian Gulf. It should supposedly include the Bahrain Islands and the principalities of Kuwait, Oman and Qatar, which are under the British protectorate. The newspapers and radios of some Arab countries connected with the British imperialists demanded that the Iranian province of Khuzestan, on whose territory the main oil fields and refineries of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company are located, be included in this new state. These provocative rumors and threats to the territorial integrity of Iran, coming from British imperialist circles, were intended to put pressure on Iran, force it to sign a supplementary agreement, and prevent the nationalization of the oil industry. Measures of financial pressure on Iran were also taken. The British Shahanshah Bank suddenly closed 2 of its offices in Iran and demanded that the Iranian government return to it guarantee deposits in the amount of £1 million art, and from Iranian firms, the repayment of all debt. In order to disorganize money circulation in Iran, the Anglo-Iranian Company, which spends in Iran itself an average of about 150 million fogs, while the total amount of money circulation in the country is 700 million fogs, suspended its purchases and settlements. This was followed by rough diplomatic pressure. In February 1951, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of England, Davies, threateningly declared in Parliament that the British government cannot be indifferent to British interests in Iran, and that Iran allegedly has no right to annul the onerous concession agreement of 1933 imposed on it on February 24, 1951. The British ambassador to Iran, Shepard, handed over to the Iranian government a note drawn up in the spirit of Davis' statement. Thereupon, in early March, Shepard made a threatening démarche to the Iranian government, declaring that the British government would not tolerate the expulsion of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company from Iran. The British resorted, as in 1932 to 1933, to military threats. Several warships were sent to the Persian Gulf and anchored on the Shatt al-Arab River near the Iranian ports of Abadan and Khorramshahr. At the same time, the British imperialists stepped up their provocative subversive activities among the Bakhshia, Qashqai, Arab and other tribes. As the Tehran press reported, agents of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company distributed weapons to the tribes inhabiting Khuzestan, and conducted demagogic propaganda among the tribal leaders that they themselves could and should directly benefit from the development of oil fields in Khuzestan and prevent wealth from Khuzestan, were captured by Tehran reactionaries. However, this time the crude threats, pressure and provocations of the British imperialists did not have the effect they expected. They further increased the indignation of the masses of the people at the imperialist policy. Many Tehran newspapers and members of the Majlis, reflecting popular indignation, expressed a sharp protest against the intervention of the British government in the internal affairs of Iran, and rejected Davis's statement and the British note on the oil issue. The intrigues and provocations of the British imperialists ran into the determined resistance of the Iranian people. The anti-imperialist movement of the peoples of Iran is directed against both British and American imperialist predators. A number of facts indicated that indignation at the provocative aggressive policy of American imperialism was growing and resistance to its intrigues was growing. At the end of January 1951, for example, after the arrival of an American ship with weapons and military materials in the port of Bandar Shapa, the population of the city organized an anti-American demonstration and blockaded the port. Iranian workers refused to unload American weapons. At the request of the demonstrators, local authorities were forced to prevent the secretary of the American embassy from entering the port, who arrived in Bandar Shapa to monitor the acceptance of weapons. The danger and fatality of the predatory and aggressive U.S. policy for the national independence, economic and political independence and sovereignty of Iran were so great and recognized by such wide sections of the Iranian people that this also affected the position of individual representatives of the ruling circles of Iran. This affected, in particular, the position of the Razma government. General Razmara, who became prime minister in June 1950, believed that Iran could be brought out of a severe economic and political crisis by obtaining an American loan, as well as by increasing deductions to the Iranian treasury from the income of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company under a supplementary agreement. But Razmar's negotiations with the United States on a loan did not yield any results. The Americans refused to give Iran a loan, demanding as a precondition the complete subjugation of Iran. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, seeking the approval of the additional agreement, also did not want to provide financial support to the Iranian government. Under these conditions, under the ever-increasing pressure of the masses, who demanded the establishment of friendly relations with the USSR, and in particular, the restoration of Soviet-Iranian trade relations violated on American orders, Razmara entered into negotiations with the Soviet government on the issue of Soviet-Iranian trade. These negotiations ended on November 4, 1950, with the signing of a Soviet-Iranian trade agreement on the resumption of trade between the Soviet Union and Iran. The agreement provided for mutual deliveries of goods within 12 months, starting on November 10, 1950, on the basis of the Soviet-Iranian Trade Agreement of March 25, 1940. Razmara also banned the broadcasting of provocative anti-Soviet Voice of America programs in Iran. In early 1951, the Razma government annulled the agreement with the American company Overseas Consultants, Inc. and invited American economic advisors to leave Iran. In a conversation with an AFP correspondent in February 1951, Razmara said that he had informed the American ambassador in Tehran, Grady, that from now on Iran would no longer insist on receiving American assistance. Razmar's government also decided to prematurely withdraw from the United States a group of Iranian officers who were sent to America to familiarize themselves with the organization system of the American Armed Forces. At the same time, Razmara continued to press for approval by the Majlis of a supplementary agreement with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and opposed the nationalization of the oil industry. Such a policy of Razmar was a hindrance to the agents of the American imperialists, who sought to completely subjugate Iran. All this led to the fact that the gangster method of physical elimination was used, which is often resorted to by imperialist diplomacy. On March 7, 1951, General Razmara was killed in the courtyard of the Tehran Mosque, where he was supposed to attend a religious ceremony. After the assassination of Razmar, the Iranian Majlis, under pressure from the popular movement, on March 15, 1951, decided to nationalize the oil industry. This decision of the Majlis was welcomed by the Iranian people and welcomed by all Iranian patriots. On March 16, a mass rally organized by the Society for the Struggle against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company took place on the square in front of the Majlis, the participants of which opposed not only the British company, but also against the intrigues of the imperialists in Iran in general. The demand for the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which rapaciously plunders Iran's natural resources and cruelly exploits the Iranian people, united all the patriotic elements of the country. At the same time, representatives of the American oil monopolies developed a feverish activity in Tehran. The American imperialists sought to use the situation to seize Iranian oil in one form or another. Representatives of American oil companies said they are ready to act as agents for the sale of Iranian oil on the international market. Some companies openly offered the Iranian government to transfer the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company into their hands, demagogically promising to pay Iran 60%, Texas Oil Company 65%, Sarkoni Vacuum Oil Company, and even 72%, Aramco, for this. All profits. The British imperialists tried in every possible way to maintain their positions. Along with sending new warships to the Persian Gulf, threatening to seize southern Iran, and arming and inciting the South Iranian nomadic tribes to rebellion, the British were forced to offer the United States to agree on the division of Iranian oil. After the assassination of Razma, the former Iranian ambassador to the United States, the well-known reactionary Hossein Allah, who was associated with imperialist circles, was appointed Prime Minister of Iran. After becoming Prime Minister, he first of all banned rallies and demonstrations, and then announced the introduction of martial law in the country for 2 months. These measures were inspired by the Anglo-American imperialists, and they were taken with the aim of suppressing the growing popular anti-imperialist movement and enabling the British and American imperialists and the ruling elite of Iran to agree during this time on the forms of further plunder in Iran. In mid-April 1951, Anglo-American talks were held in Washington on how to settle the Anglo-Iranian oil conflict. These Washington talks, which were a crude and open intervention of the Anglo-American imperialists in the internal affairs of Iran, and an attempt to collude them at Iran's expense and behind its back, aroused deep indignation among the Iranian people. 40,000 people protested against the conspiracy of the imperialists directed against the Iranian people in the square in front of the Majlis in Tehran. At the end of March 1951, a powerful strike of oil workers broke out at the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was a formidable warning to the imperialist and reactionary circles that they would not be able to solve the oil issue without the participation of the Iranian people and behind their backs. After the decision of the Majlis to nationalize the oil industry, the British colonialists further intensified the exploitation of Iranian workers. A few days after the decision of the Majlis, the British announced their refusal to pay workers for difficult working conditions 30% of the wage supplement that the workers received before. The company also closed food stores on the territory of the fields. In response to this, the oil workers of Bendamasha and Agayori went on strike on March 24, which quickly spread to other oil enterprises and fields in Abadan, Haftkal, Gachsaran, Masjid Solimain, Lali, Naftasefid, etc. In order to please the imperialists, the UL government, having introduced martial law, immediately sent troops to the oil fields. There were mass arrests of workers. The soldiers were ordered to fire on the strikers. Several dozen workers were killed and wounded in Abadan and Bendamasha. At the same time, the headquarters of the British Naval Forces sent 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 12 destroyers and other warships to the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf, which, together with the British warships in these bays, made up a squadron of 40 units. But the military threats of the British and the massacres of the Iranian troops against the strikers did not break the will of the workers to fight. A movement of solidarity with the striking oil workers unfolded across the country. Strikes and demonstrations of solidarity were held at oil refineries in Kermanshah, as well as in Isfahan, Tehran, Qom, Kashan, and other cities of Iran. The movement in defense of the striking oil workers took on a nationwide character. Under these conditions, the administration of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was forced to make concessions. On April 16, an agreement was signed in Bendamasha, according to which the company undertook to pay workers' wages for the days of the strike, as well as the cancelled allowance for difficult working conditions. The company was also forced to pledge that the strikers would not be persecuted. The same concessions had to be made to the English company in Agayori. The strike in Abadan and other places continued until the end of April 1951. The strike of the Iranian oil workers and the movement of solidarity with them, which swept the whole of Iran, showed that the ferocious terror, bloody repressions and collusion of the Anglo-American imperialists, an internal reaction, could not break the resolve of the Iranian people to fight for his life rights and the independence of the country. Even the British reactionary Daily Telegraph and Morning Post was forced to admit, after these events, that the People's Party, driven underground, enjoys much more influence than the Iranian government. These events, as well as disagreements between the government and the Majlis Commission, headed by opposition leader Mossadegh, on oil issues regarding practical measures to nationalize the oil industry, led to the resignation of Hossein Allah's government. On April 29, Mossadegh, leader of the National Front, was appointed Prime Minister of Iran. The National Front includes nationalist-minded landowner bourgeois politicians and intellectuals who believe that the only way to bring the country out of the economic and financial crisis and prevent the danger of communism from penetrating is through the liquidation of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The main point of the program of the government of Mossadegh was the implementation of the law approved by the Majlis on the nationalization of the oil industry. On May 2, the Shah of Iran signed a decree on the nationalization of the oil industry. Under these conditions, when, as a result of the powerful upsurge of the anti-imperialist movement in the country, the main position of British imperialism in Iran was threatened, and a serious threat arose that this movement would also frustrate American plans for Iranian oil, the American imperialists were forced to abandon the hypocritical, demagogic game in support of the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, and, together with England, began to exert brute pressure on the government of Mossadegh, trying to force him to capitulate to the British. The American and British imperialists, in the process of bargaining both on Iranian oil and on other issues, in particular in the Far East, openly opposed the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. On May 19, the British ambassador to Iran, Shepard, presented the Iranian government with a note stating that the British government does not recognize the Iranian government's right to annul the 1933 concession agreement concluded with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and proposes to start negotiations on the conditions for concluding another agreements on the exploitation of Iranian oil. At the same time, a U.S. government statement was published in which the U.S. government supported the British position and insisted on resolving the issue through negotiations. On May 26, U.S. Ambassador to Iran Grady delivered a note to the Iranian government stating that the U.S. government reaffirmed its opposition to the nationalization of the oil industry. Not limited to this pressure, at the end of May, U.S. President Truman sent a letter to Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh, in which he insisted to start negotiations with England in connection with the Iranian oil issue. Rough British and American interference in the internal affairs of Iran further increased popular indignation. In mid-May, at the First Congress of the National Society for the Struggle Against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, it was decided to give the society a new name: the National Society for the Struggle Against the Imperialist Oil Companies in Iran. This showed that the anti-imperialist movement in the country was directed against both the British and American imperialists. The indignation and indignation of the Iranian people was expressed in the grandiose mass rallies and demonstrations that took place throughout the country in the last days of May, and especially on May 29, the day of the 18th anniversary of the signing of the concession agreement of 1933. Mejlis, in which more than 80,000 people participated. The meeting participants enthusiastically adopted a resolution demanding the complete elimination of the imperialist invaders from Iranian industry through the immediate and uncompromising nationalization of the oil industry. The resolution protested against the recognition of any rights to the imperialist oil companies, and in particular with regard to the sale of Iranian oil products to the imperialists. The rally participants strongly protested against British and American interference in Iran's internal affairs. They also demanded the lifting of martial law in Khuzestan, the freedom of parties, trade unions and all democratic societies, the introduction of an 8-hour working day, and the adoption of an electoral law that provides equal rights to the entire population. Similar mass demonstrations and rallies took place in many other Iranian cities. The Iranian press also protested and expressed indignation at the impudent interference of US British imperialism in the affairs of Iran. To put pressure on Iran, the British imperialists used the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which, at the Anglo-American order, in response to an appeal to it by the British government on July 5, ruled that it was necessary to settle the issue between the two governments. The decision demanded that no measures be taken that could prevent the exploitation of the fields to the extent that it was carried out before May 1, 1951, i.e., that the uncontrolled management of AINK in the oil affairs of southern Iran be restored. The Iranian government refused to recognize the legitimacy of the International Court of Justice, which exposed itself, by this decision, as a tool of the Anglo-American imperialists. Then, simultaneously with the ongoing British military threats and the sending of British troops to Iraq to the Iranian borders, on July 9, American Ambassador Grady handed over to the Iranian Prime Minister a new letter from US President Truman, in which the latter insisted that Iran accept the recommendation of the International Court of Justice. In addition, the Iranian government was invited in this letter to receive in Tehran a special representative of Truman, Harriman, to consider the oil problem. Even before that, American warships were sent to the shores of Iran from Singapore. In mid-July, Harriman, who is one of the main representatives of the American monopolies in the US government, arrived in Tehran and began negotiations with the Iranian government, which were aimed, as the press noted, to force Iran to capitulate to the Anglo-American imperialists, once again press Britain out of Iran and cash in on the oil conflict. The plan proposed by the US British imperialists, during Harriman's talks, to resolve the oil issue amounted to the nominal transfer of the AIOC to the Iranian National Oil Company for a fee. In fact, the exploration, extraction, refining and sale of oil were to remain at the disposal of two new companies, the so-called Operational Organization and Purchasing Organization, which in reality would be run by foreign imperialists, primarily American ones. Simultaneously with Harriman's arrival in Iran, Gaston, chairman of the American Export-Import Bank, announced a $25 million loan to Iran, adding privately in Washington that the loan would give US oil companies free access to Iranian oil. He signaled that the $25 million loan was only the first step in financing and that further loans would be made available to the Mossadegh government to serve the US government's interests in Iran. At the same time, the American technical firm Lee Factors Incorporated offered to send 2,500 American specialists to Iran to replace British personnel and manage oil refineries. Harriman's arrival in Tehran on July 15, 1951, provoked a 100,000-strong protest demonstration, which, in order to please the American imperialists, was shot by order of the police chief. 100 people were killed and more than 500 were injured. But these bloody massacres could not stop the popular anti-imperialist movement, which continued to grow and expand. Under these conditions, the Mossadegh government refused to accept the demands of the Anglo-American imperialists, put forward during the Harriman negotiations in Tehran in August 1951. The Mossadegh government took some measures to implement the law on the nationalization of the oil industry. In particular, at the beginning of October 1951, at the request of the Iranian government, 300 British specialists were removed from Abadan and Khuzestan from oil refineries and oil fields, who had to leave Iran. The management of the oil fields and oil refineries had been taken over by the Iranian authorities even before that. Convinced of the failure of its attempts to intimidate Iran with threats of invasion by British troops, Britain, with the support of the United States, in October brought the issue of Iranian oil to the Security Council. The Soviet Union opposed raising this issue in the Security Council and supported Iran's point of view that the nationalization of the oil industry in Iran is an exclusively internal affair of Iran and cannot fall within the competence of the Security Council. The Anglo-American imperialists tried to use the discussion of the issue of Iranian oil in the Security Council to once again impose on Iran the proposal that a foreign company manage the Iranian oil industry. But, as a United Press Washington correspondent reported on November 8, Iranian Premier Mossadegh turned down the US-backed proposal. Further events will show whether the Mossadegh government will capitulate to Britain and the United States on the oil issue, or, relying on a widespread popular anti-imperialist movement, rebuff Anglo-American pressure and blackmail, and carry out the nationalization of the oil industry. Undoubtedly, the recent events in Iran are of great importance not only for Iran, but also for other countries of the Near and Middle East. They evoked a powerful response among the broadest masses of the peoples of these countries. At the end of March 1951, the question of the nationalization of foreign oil companies operating in Iraq was also raised in the Iraqi parliament. At the beginning of June 1951, popular anti-imperialist demonstrations began in the Bahrain Islands. The population of the Bahraini Islands demands the nationalization of the oil industry in Bahrain, which is in the hands of the Americans, the expulsion of the Bahraini sheikh and the English advisor, and the transfer of all matters of administration of the islands to the Iranian authorities. In July, Lebanese newspapers came forward demanding the nationalization of French, American, and other foreign companies in Lebanon. In June, the working people of Egypt put forward demands for the nationalization of the Anglo-Egyptian oil, transport, and other foreign companies. A group of Egyptian youth, including journalists, lawyers, and others, set up a preparatory committee to demand the nationalization of the International Suez Canal Company. On October 8, 1951, the Egyptian government submitted a bill to the Egyptian parliament to annul the unequal Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 and the Convention of 1899, on the basis of which British troops occupy the territory of Egypt and Sudan. The Egyptian parliament approved this bill. All these events testify to the powerful upsurge of the national liberation movement in Iran and throughout the Near and Middle East. More and more masses of the working people of Iran and its neighboring countries are rising up to fight against the imperialist enslavers and for national independence. The defeat of German and Japanese imperialism and the weakening of the British Empire, the establishment of people's democratic power in the countries of Central and Southeastern Europe, the growth of the economic and political power of the USSR and the countries of people's democracy, as well as the decisive opposition of the democratic camp led by the USSR to the aggressive plans of the American and British imperialism, the chief stifler of the freedom of the oppressed peoples. All this caused the weakening of the entire system of imperialism and thereby rendered decisive assistance to the colonial and dependent peoples in their struggle against imperialism. The world historic victory of the great Chinese people over the united forces of the reactionary Kuomintang and American imperialism dealt a new crushing blow to the imperialist system and opened up even broader prospects for the national liberation struggle in the colonial and dependent countries. These circumstances create favorable conditions for the development of the anti-imperialist struggle of the peoples of Asia, including the Iranian people, for national independence, peace and freedom. The powerful movement against Anglo-American imperialism that has recently unfolded in Iran marks the beginning of a new stage in the struggle of the peoples of Iran against imperialist oppression. The intrigues and provocations of the imperialists are unable to stop this growing movement. Together with other peoples of the East and with the support of the progressive forces of the whole world, the peoples of Iran will continue their struggle against the forces of imperialism and reaction, and will win freedom and independence for themselves.